Welcome, people of planet Earth and all planets beyond. Thank you guys so much for watching. My name is Josh, and today we're going to talk about how to identify vintage JerZees t-shirt tags. So let's get into it. So JerZees first started as a subsidiary of the Russell Athletic brand in the early 80s during the blank t-shirt boom, when everybody wanted blank t-shirts so they could print their band logos on, their movie promos on, etc., etc. JerZees would go on to be a popular t-shirt to print on, but it was their hoodies and their sweatshirts that got a lot of attention. Using their new blend of materials, screen printers loved to print on them, and they became very popular. You've probably seen some vintage sweatshirts out there in any thrift store you go to. A lot of times you'll see them with like grandma craft work on them. Very popular in the early 90s. JerZees is still around today as a subsidiary of Russell Athletic brand, which is a subsidiary of like Fruit of the Loom, which is a subsidiary of Berkshire Hathaway or something like that. They've been bought and sold many times at this point and merged with other companies, but JerZees as a unique brand still does remain today. Now, like with most t-shirts, the best way to really identify an era for that t-shirt is to look at the tags. Though it is important to remember that the way that this industry worked was that t-shirts were sold to screen printers who then screen printed onto those t-shirts. So that inventory might have lasted a lot longer than the relative era of the care tag that we will be looking at. So you might find a t-shirt here and there outside of the era that we talk about. Now, the earliest JerZees tag that I've been able to identify is this like yellow gold on black that says JerZees, and also has the Russell branding still attached to it, clearly identifying it as a subsidiary of the Russell Athletic brand. This tag ran from like the early 80s to the mid 80s, and then there was a second tag which actually takes on a few more of the characteristics of the Russell brand. You can see that here, clearly having the same red, white, and blue color palette as the Russell brand, and including the Russell branding. This tag ran from the mid 80s to the late 80s, and then was replaced by what is probably the most iconic of all the JerZees tags, and that's when they dropped the Russell branding, just included JerZees, and added the grid tag. This grid tag design would carry on through the 90s and is perhaps the most iconic of all the JerZees tags. It's probably the most likely tag you'll find on both t-shirts and sweatshirts. Now, from the early 90s to the mid 90s or so, we have a lot of different variations of this grid tag. See, the Super Tees tag has a little bit of the grid on it. Also in this 50/50 tag with the grid on it. This was very common for the early 90s. Now, it's safe to say if your JerZees tag has this grid anywhere on it, it's likely from 96 or so and earlier. Now, up until this point, most, if not all, of JerZees t-shirts were produced in the USA and would say as such. But after the passing of NAFTA and a few years later, we started seeing JerZees tags, even with the grid logo, being produced in places like Honduras. Typically, they would say something like, made in Honduras of U.S. components. This was sort of a phrase that I'm not sure they were even required to say, but helped to sort of soften the blow of the loss of t-shirt manufacturing to international producers. So in the late 90s, around 96 or 97, JerZees made a pretty significant change to the branding of the tags, as you can see here. They've got more of a rectangular with a box, still emphasizing the Z, obviously, but very different. The color palette somewhat muted from the earlier 90s and 80s versions, but this tag ran from the late 90s into the early 2000s, even into sort of the closer to the 2010s. Now, generally, while the branding stayed the same, the tag became much more polyester, silky feeling than the earlier textured nylon feeling of the earlier tags. At this point in the late 90s as well, many of the t-shirts were still made in the US, but progressively as you got further into the early 2000s, less and less t-shirts were made in the US and more often were made in other countries, so that can give you at least somewhat of an idea of how old your JerZees tag from the early 2000s might really be. Now, while JerZees only has a vintage history of about 20 years from the early 80s to the early 2000s, there are plenty of tags. They were plenty popular out there, so get out there and find them and identify them. There are some great t-shirts to be found. Now, if you still need help identifying knowing the age of your particular t-shirt, check the eye above for a video with even more methods on how to pinpoint the production date of your t-shirts. Otherwise, thank you guys so much for watching. Please remember to like, comment, subscribe. We'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.